Now we're going to work on the flat-felled seam. Now this seam is the opposite. It's all of the steps except for the final step in the French seam and the flat-felled seam are the same with different measurements. Whereas the French seam we want to use for lightweight sheer delicate fabrics, the flat-felled seam is for something that needs to be very sturdy and that is going to have a lot of stress and pressure put on it. The flat-felled seam is your strongest seam. It's not used in apparel as much. If you look on the inner seam of your jeans, there might be a flat-felled seam there. But you might see this on tarps or flags or things of that nature. But you may have a garment that's going to be in a production that is possibly outerwear that might be involved in a scene that has a lot of action, in which case you want to make sure this thing doesn't get pulled apart. So you want to put the strongest seam possible. Now this requires a 1-inch seam allowance at least, because I mean, I guess you can have them smaller, but the larger, longer seam allowance gives you much better structure and makes it even sturdier. And once again, we need to understand where the right and wrong sides are, or the face side and the inside. So I'm going to make a little pattern on one side of these guys. All right. So like I said, the flat-felled seam the steps are very similar to the French seam. We'll start with our edges together. Pin it as you need, perpendicular or parallel, however many you need to put in there. Now this one we're going to start at 3/8 of an inch. So our initial stitch for the flat-felled seam is 3/8 of an inch, which is the first line, the first full line after the presser foot. Start at the edge of the fabric, presser foot down, couple steps forward, couple stitches back for a back stitch. Again, we're just guiding the fabric through the machine's doing the work. This is wrong sides together. We come to the end, back stitch again, looper up to the top, presser foot up, clip, and clip. So once again, because this is going to be encased inside the seam, we want to make sure that we don't have any of this raw edge poking through. So I'm going to trim this seam down in half as well. This is especially true, important step to do if you're using smaller increments for your seam allowance. If you've cut a smaller seam allowance, so you need to use up less fabric. All right, now once again, right, what's our mantra? So clip, press. So we need to press this open. Again, you can use that finger pressing technique to kind of get it started, get that opened up, especially since it's a narrower seam. And then we'll press the seam open. You want to be careful, especially when using a steam iron, because if you're trying to keep that open as you're pressing along, that steam can come out and scald your finger, or if you don't move your finger fast enough, you can hit it with the tip of the iron. So you want to be very careful with the iron in your fingertips, because that steam can scald you just as much as the metal plate can burn you. So just be careful. They make it's like a little sweater that you put over your fingertip to help protect you from that, but I haven't ever used one. I've only seen them. All right. So step 1, stitch 3/8 wrong sides together, trim down seam. Press seam open. Now for step 2, just like in the French seam, we're now gonna close this or fold it with right sides together with our seam at the very edge here. All right, so now our final, this is going to be sewn at 5/8 of an inch. So we want a nice deeper seam allowance here so that we've got a good amount of fabric kind of in place to help it be stronger. So that's where the 1 inch seam allowance comes in, because we've already stitched it 3/8. 3/8 and 5/8 is 8/8, which is 1. All right. Place our needle, drop our presser foot, couple stitches forward and back. And now we're guiding that at 5/8 of an inch. So again, process exactly the same as French seam with the exception of the measurements we're using. I keep forgetting that doesn't work. Now here's the last step, which makes it a flat-felled seam and not just a deep French seam. So we've sewn, we've clipped, now we're going to press. And you're just going to press this over to one side. It doesn't really matter which side. In a garment, things tend to get pressed toward the front and or the center. But we don't have a front or a center here. All right, so now we've got our nice seam on the outside. We've got our seam allowance pressed over to one side, but our next and final step is we're going to stitch the seam allowance to the body of the garment. So I've gotten that pressed so it's laying nice and flat. And it again, I normally probably wouldn't be pinning this, but for demonstration purposes, it might help you to be able to pin it better. So we just want that to lay nice and flat. We want to make sure that while that's happening, that this side stays flat and we don't get it folded over on itself. So where we're going to be sewing, and if you wanted to draw yourself a line, you could. We're going to be stitching right here along the very edge of our seam allowance. So we want to be within an 1/8 or even a 1/16 inch of that edge of the seam. For me, on this machine, now we can't use these guides because they're covered by the body of the garment. So I'm going to place my needle in the machine where I want it to start. And depending on your machine, there could be a little guide out front to help you. You could look in this little window inside the presser foot to use, like the little opening of the window as your guide. However, it's going to work. I tend to just watch the needle going into the fabric. And I can also, there's this little divot that's in right here in the sewing machine. If I keep the edge of that seam just inside that little opening, I know that's going to give me a consistent placement. And this could be an instance where you might move the needle over. So if you wanted that window to be your guide, but the needle wasn't quite in the right place, you could flip it so that it's over closer to that side. All right, we finished with a back stitch, looper at the top, lift up your presser foot, clip, and clip. So now here's the outside. Oh, well, we've got a little thread monster. Just pull that thread in there. So this is what happened is the tail of the thread when I started sewing got caught. So the seam isn't compromised. There was just this tail of fabric here just got caught in it while I was sewing. So this is my outside. So I have our right side with our pattern. There's the seam. There's our decorative parts from the stitching the seam down, and inside, see, this is our seam edge, and this is where we stitched right along the edge of the seam to hold it in place. So that is your flat felled seam. That is your strongest seam. For our project, this seam is extra credit. Your standard and French seams will be the required elements. That is the flat felled seam. Thank you.